Under the bright CNN studio light stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her maroon suit radiating quiet confidence as she readied herself to confront one of the country's most renowned legal figures. Just moments before, Alan Dershowitz, the 85-year-old Harvard Law professor emeritus and celebrated attorney, had emerged from backstage holding a thick stack of papers, his face set with determination. "I have the evidence here that will reveal the Congresswoman's lack of legal grasp," Dershowitz announced to the moderator, his voice carrying the steady weight of someone who had appeared before the Supreme Court dozens of times. "She may be a rising star in her party, but tonight the audience will see she is clearly in over her head." The crowd stirred, phones lifted, ready to capture what promised to be a fiery exchange. With his many decades of experience, his Harvard credentials, and a client list that read like a tabloid headline, Dershowitz looked certain this would be a quick victory against a congresswoman who had only been in office for 2 years. Yet Crockett never wavered. The former public defender and civil rights lawyer stood calm and collected, a subtle, knowing smile playing on her lips as she locked eyes with him. She had prepared meticulously for this moment, and anyone familiar with her recognized that look. This was not going to be a routine debate. It was about to become one of the toughest nights in Dershowitz's long and storied career. As the CNN cameras started rolling, the host introduced the segment focused on voting rights legislation. Neither participant broke eye contact during their intense stare-down. The veteran legal scholar was moments away from discovering that underestimating Jasmine Crockett would turn out to be his greatest misstep on national television. Before we dive into this extraordinary exchange, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth political debates and breakdowns. You're definitely going to want to watch every second of how Congresswoman Crockett flipped the script on one of America's most famous lawyers. The CNN studio hummed with excitement as host Rebecca Mitchell kicked off the conversation. Tonight we have 2 legal experts joining us to discuss the Voting Rights Protection Act currently making its way through Congress. We're joined by Harvard Law professor emeritus Alan Dershowitz, who has argued cases before the Supreme Court and represented numerous high-profile clients, and Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a former public defender and civil rights attorney now in her first term in the U.S. House of Representatives. Dershowitz sat perfectly upright, silver hair neatly parted, wearing a sharp navy suit that screamed establishment authority. At 85, he carried the gravitas of decades spent shaping legal minds and defending figures ranging from O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein. His face was resolute. He hadn't come merely to talk, he had come to dominate. "Thank you for having me, Rebecca," he started, his Boston accent still evident. "I've been teaching constitutional law since before the Congresswoman was even born. The American people deserve to hear from someone who truly understands the legal intricacies at play." The condescension dripped from every word. He shuffled his papers, pointing to highlighted passages of the bill and past court decisions, props designed to reinforce his dominance. Across the table, Crockett remained perfectly composed in her maroon suit, a gold necklace glinting under the lights. At 43, the Yale-trained lawyer had earned her reputation not in elite salons but in courtrooms defending ordinary Americans before running for office and winning her congressional seat. Her serene expression hid a razor-sharp legal mind that had triumphed over countless opponents who made the mistake of underestimating her. "Good evening," Crockett said calmly, a hint of her Texas drawl coming through. "Unlike some, I'm not here to lecture the country from an ivory tower. I'm here to discuss legislation that actually affects real voters, people I've represented both in the courtroom and now in Congress." Rebecca Mitchell nodded, feeling the tension rise. "Let's start with the fundamentals. Professor Dershowitz, you've labeled this bill an unconstitutional overreach. Congresswoman Crockett, you're one of its co-sponsors. What exactly is at stake?" Before Crockett could answer, Dershowitz leaned in. "What's at stake is nothing short of the constitutional separation of powers," he declared. "The Congresswoman and her colleagues want the federal government to seize control over areas the Constitution explicitly leaves to the states. This isn't merely bad policy, it's flatly unconstitutional. I'm astonished that anyone with a law degree would back it." The camera caught Crockett's faint smile, not one of amusement, but of recognition. She had faced this exact brand of dismissive, patronizing tactics from prosecutors and opposing counsel countless times. "I've litigated voting rights cases directly affected by Shelby County," Crockett replied coolly. "The question isn't whether states have authority, it's whether that authority can be wielded to silence voters." The professor's jaw tightened. That's exactly the sort of emotional plea that muddies this debate. The Constitution guarantees equal protection, not voting convenience. When restrictions fall disproportionately on certain communities, Crockett fired back, "We're not talking about convenience, we're talking about constitutionality." Rebecca jumped in, "Let's look at specific provisions." "Professor, you've attacked the bill's minimum early voting requirements." "Why?" Dershowitz leaned forward again. "This is classic federal overreach. States vary widely in population and resources. A one-size-fits-all mandate ignores reality and tramples federalism. I have statements from election officials in 17 states warning that these rules would create chaos. The Congresswoman is putting ideology ahead of practicality." Crockett waited her turn, then answered calmly. "Interesting that you bring up election officials. I have statements from administrators in 23 states, including Republicans, who say these standards are both feasible and necessary." She looked straight at Dershowitz. "Let's talk consistency, Professor. In your 1982 book Rights of the People, you argued that federal voting standards may be needed when states demonstrate persistent discrimination or failure. You explicitly supported national early voting minimums. Has the Constitution changed, or has your position?" The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz's brief flash of surprise. He hadn't expected her to cite his own work. Riffling through papers, he responded, "Scholarly views evolve with new evidence. The electoral landscape is different now than in the 1980s. My earlier stance reflected specific circumstances of that era. So constitutional principles shift with the political winds." Crockett asked. "Fascinating, coming from someone who claims to be an originalist." Tension spiked as Rebecca moved on. "Let's turn to voter ID laws. Critics argue your bill undermines election integrity." "Those critics ignore the evidence," Crockett answered. "Study after study, including from the Brennan Center, shows voter impersonation fraud is virtually non-existent. What is real is that roughly 25 million eligible Americans lack the documents these laws demand." Dershowitz scoffed. "The Brennan Center is hardly neutral, and claiming millions can't obtain ID insults voters' intelligence." Crockett's voice sharpened just a touch. "Professor, have you ever represented a client who lost their vote because they couldn't afford a birth certificate? I've sat with elderly people who never had one. I've talked to working parents who can't get to the DMV because it's only open 9 to 5. Calling those barriers insults is exactly the ivory tower disconnect I was talking about." Feeling the tide turning, Dershowitz changed tactics. "Personal stories don't override state authority to secure elections. The Supreme Court has upheld reasonable ID requirements." "Then let's discuss those cases," Crockett countered. In Crawford v. Marion County, which upheld Indiana's law, the court specifically noted the record contained little evidence of actual burden. When real evidence of widespread disenfranchisement exists, the constitutional calculus shifts. She held up another document. "And in your own 2005 Harvard Law Review article, you criticized judges who mask policy preferences behind selective constitutional interpretation, using voter ID laws as a prime example of states hiding partisan motives behind fraud claims. You're taking that out of context," he shot back. "Am I?" Crockett replied, eyebrow raised. "I can read the entire paragraph if you'd rather like." Rebecca stepped in quickly. "We need to take a short break. We'll be right back with more on voting rights and viewer questions." As the cameras cut, Dershowitz leaned urgently toward his aide, whispering and jabbing at his notes. Something had gone badly wrong. His aide scrambled through the stack of papers. Across the table, Crockett calmly took a sip of water. A producer approached. "Congresswoman, do you need anything?" "I'm good," she replied evenly, "but you might want to check on the professor. We haven't even gotten to the real contradictions yet." When the show returned, the dynamic had visibly changed. Dershowitz appeared composed but noticeably tense. "During the break I reviewed my own writings, not the Congresswoman's cherry-picked quotes," he began. "My position has always been that election laws must balance access and integrity. That's all states are trying to do." He stared directly at Crockett. "But since we're talking credentials, let's be clear, I've argued more than 50 cases before the Supreme Court. I've taught constitutional law to thousands of this nation's finest lawyers. With respect, your short time as a state legislator and first-term congresswoman hardly equip you to school me on constitutional meaning." The condescension was thick, and viewers at home immediately picked up on it. Crockett had been waiting for exactly this. Professor, she began, voice calm but cutting, the same tone she used in court when an opponent stepped on a landmine. I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. She continued, steady as ever, the problem is that you're leaning on your resume instead of answering my arguments. That might intimidate students who are worried about grades, but this isn't a Harvard seminar, and I'm not your student. Dershowitz's face tightened. I am addressing substance, he insisted. You're the one dragging up decades-old quotes. I'm pointing out that your views have shifted over time, Crockett returned. Let's stay with today's topic. You say states must have broad authority over elections. Yet in December 2020 you argued that state legislatures aren't even bound by their own state constitutions when choosing presidential electors, a position that would have thrown out millions of votes. She held up a printout. You wrote, and I quote, "The Constitution assigns this power to state legislatures, not to states generally." How do you square that with your sudden devotion to federalism? Dershowitz shifted in his seat. That was a narrow argument about the electors clause, not general election administration. Is it really? Crockett pressed. Because both involve the same core tension, federalism versus protecting the franchise. Yet your interpretation seems to change depending on which side benefits politically. The audience murmured as Dershowitz's face reddened. That's ridiculous. My positions are rooted in constitutional text, not partisanship. Crockett gave a small nod. Then let's examine the text. You love citing Shelby County versus Holder against federal oversight, yet in that very opinion Chief Justice Roberts reaffirmed Congress's authority to combat voting discrimination, the exact authority this bill exercises. She leaned in. The difference, Professor, is that I've represented actual voters harmed by Shelby County. I've seen polling places closed in black neighborhoods, voter purges that mysteriously target eligible minority citizens, ID laws surgically drafted to exclude certain groups. Dershowitz tried to jump in, but Crockett raised a hand. Please, I listen to you respectfully. He fell silent, sensing the shift. You tout your Supreme Court record, and I respect it, she went on. But I've practiced in state courts where voting rights determine whether real people get to participate in democracy. I've helped senior citizens restore their registration after bureaucratic nightmares. That's where constitutional theory meets reality, not in a lecture hall. Holding up the bill, she added, this legislation doesn't federalize elections as you claim. It sets basic floor standards to stop the worst suppression while leaving states wide latitude in implementation. Mitchell, feeling the turning point, looked to Dershowitz. Professor, your response? Dershowitz gathered himself. The Congresswoman's stories are moving, but they don't override the Constitution. Primary authority over elections belongs to states, not Congress. This bill goes too far. Section 306 alone imposes 42 separate mandates on early voting hours and locations. That's not a floor, that's a takeover. Crockett's faint smile returned. I'm glad you mentioned Section 306, Professor. It's modeled on a proposal you yourself endorsed in 1991 congressional testimony. You called virtually identical measures, appropriately tailored federal safeguards that respect state authority while guaranteeing ballot access. The studio went dead quiet as Crockett slid the 1991 transcript across the table. This is your testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, March 14, 1991. Would you like me to read the relevant portion? Dershowitz blinked several times, clearly rattled. I'd need the full context. Of course, Crockett said smoothly, pushing the document closer. Please, take your time. As he scanned the page, the camera caught his expression moving from certainty to confusion to quiet dismay. The words were exactly as she described. Crockett faced the lens. This is the heart of my concern. Too often voting rights are treated as abstract legal puzzles rather than the real protections millions depend on. The same experts who once backed federal safeguards now fight them, not because the Constitution changed, but because the politics did. Trying to regain footing, Dershowitz said, even if I supported something similar decades ago, and I'd need to verify, the constitutional landscape has shifted with subsequent Supreme Court decisions. Which decision specifically? Crockett asked calmly. Because Shelby County explicitly preserved Congress's enforcement power, it simply required updated coverage criteria. That's precisely what this bill provides, based on fresh evidence of discrimination. She turned to Mitchell. Rebecca, the real question isn't some academic debate over constitutionality. It's whether every eligible American, regardless of zip code, work schedule, or disability, gets equal access to the ballot. The Constitution's text and history make clear Congress has the duty to act when that access is threatened. Dershowitz shuffled papers in silence as the room waited. Critics had accused Crockett of arguing from emotion rather than law. She raised an eyebrow. Emotion. Then let's get precise. She proceeded to dismantle his objections point by point. Article 1, Section 4's Elections Clause, the enforcement clauses of the 14th and 15th Amendments, recent cases like Brnovich v. DNC that reaffirmed congressional authority, delivering a clinic in constitutional law grounded in practical experience. Dershowitz attempted multiple interruptions, each time she parried effortlessly, revealing deeper mastery of both the law and the legislation. His frustration became palpable. In a final gambit, he declared, "Congresswoman, with respect, I don't think you grasp the unintended consequences. Section 502 could actually dilute minority voting strength in some local races." Crockett's smile widened just a fraction. "Professor, there is no Section 502 in this bill. The legislation has 428 sections total." The studio froze. Dershowitz frantically flipped pages, realizing he had conflated bills, a shocking error for someone presenting himself as the ultimate expert. I apologize," he said, voice softer. "I meant Section 402. Crockett replied evenly, "Section 402 governs ballot drop boxes, Professor. It has zero impact on minority vote dilution. Perhaps you're thinking of H.R. 2722 from the previous Congress, an entirely different bill." That moment crystallized everything that had unfolded. Despite the resume, Dershowitz had walked in without fully reading the current legislation, relying on talking points. Crockett, who had helped write parts of the bill, answered every detail with precision and accuracy. Sensing the historic shift, Mitchell asked Dershowitz, "Professor, given the Congresswoman's clarifications, would you like to revise any of your criticisms?" His usual swagger gone, he answered, "I maintain constitutional concerns, but I concede some of my objections may have rested on outdated or mistaken information. I'll need to review the text more carefully." Crockett nodded graciously. "I appreciate that, Professor. I'd be glad to provide a full analysis showing how every section aligns with established precedent. Perhaps we can at least agree that every American's right to vote deserves protection." Her calm generosity highlighted the stark contrast, one clinging to prestige, the other rooted in substance and experience. As the segment wrapped, it was obvious to every viewer that they had just witnessed a watershed moment. Authority in American legal discourse would never again automatically belong to reputation alone. Within minutes, clips flooded social media. The non-existent Section 502 moment rocketed past 1 million views in an hour. Hashtag Crockett clapback and hashtag Dershowitz wrong section trended nationwide. Commentators across the spectrum weighed in. Conservative analyst Andrew McCarthy tweeted, "Policy views aside, Crockett just delivered a masterclass in preparation. Dershowitz brought generalities, she brought receipts." That night Rachel Maddow opened her show saying, "We just watched the legal equivalent of David slaying Goliath, only with pinpoint citations instead of a slingshot." Behind the scenes at CNN, producers scrambled to capitalize on what had become the network's highest-rated segment of the month, quickly greenlighting a special titled The New Defenders, Rising Voices Reshaping Legal Debate, starring Crockett. In his Manhattan apartment, Alan Dershowitz endured one of the most humbling nights of his career. His phone lit up with calls and texts from colleagues, former students, and reporters. Harvard Law internal forums erupted. Several professors noted that Crockett had turned Dershowitz's own Socratic method against him. By morning he issued a statement, "While I retain constitutional concerns about federal election legislation, I recognize Congresswoman Crockett exhibited impressive command of the issues. Vigorous, well-prepared advocacy on all sides strengthens public discourse." The diplomatic wording was widely seen as damage control. For Crockett the aftermath was transformative. Interview requests poured in, her social following tripled overnight, and House Democratic leadership asked her to lead the next day's voting rights press conference. 3 previously undecided representatives called to pledge support for the bill. Momentum that once seemed impossible now felt inevitable. Law blogs and academic circles buzzed. A Yale professor wrote, "Crockett proved that lived experience combined with rigorous scholarship can yield more accurate, more persuasive constitutional analysis than detached theory." Georgetown Law announced a panel, Credentials versus Substance, Reassessing Legal Authority in Public Debate. Civil rights groups seized the moment. The NAACP and Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights issued statements reaffirming the constitutional basis for federal protections. Voter education organizations in Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona reported huge volunteer surges, many citing Crockett as inspiration. Conservative outlets tried to reframe the narrative. Laura Ingraham argued the Section 502 flub didn't negate broader constitutional problems, but even Fox legal guests conceded Dershowitz had been outmatched on facts. He leaned on prestige, she leaned on homework, former Judge Andrew Napolitano admitted. 3 days later an unexpected olive branch arrived. Dershowitz requested a private meeting in Crockett's Capitol Hill office. He arrived alone, no cameras, no staff. "Congresswoman," he began, tone markedly different, "I've now read the bill thoroughly. While I still question certain provisions, your constitutional analysis was largely sound. And your emphasis on real-world impact, that was well taken. Theory without application is hollow." Ever gracious, Crockett invited him to co-write an op-ed exploring common ground on voting rights while acknowledging differences. "The public should see that constitutional interpretation doesn't have to be partisan," she said. After some thought he agreed. Their joint Washington Post piece, Finding Constitutional Common Ground on Voting Rights, went viral for all the right reasons, concluding, when debate prioritizes substance over status, evidence over authority, democracy itself is strengthened. For Jasmine Crockett, the Dershowitz debate became a defining milestone, not just in her congressional tenure but in her larger mission to center real people in legal and policy fights. In the following week she received speaking invitations from Harvard, Yale, and Howard Law. Enrollment in voting rights courses spiked the next semester. Most touching were the thousands of messages from young attorneys, law students, and especially women of color in the profession who saw her as proof they belonged. "You showed us we don't have to shrink our lived experience to challenge power," wrote one second-year student from Michigan. On Capitol Hill the ripple effects continued. 3 Republican senators reached out about possible compromise language on early voting. At a Congressional Black Caucus meeting, Representative James Clyburn told her, "You didn't just win a debate, you changed the entire conversation." That's how real change starts. 6 weeks later a revised Voting Rights Protection Act passed the House with bipartisan votes. Senate passage remained uncertain, but the bill now had momentum no one had thought possible before that viral night. Analysts credited Crockett with reframing both the constitutional and human dimensions of voting rights for a national audience. In communications, law, and political science classrooms the exchange became required viewing, a case study in how preparation, expertise, and conviction can topple entrenched authority. It reminded the country that in a functioning democracy, ideas must stand or fall on their merits, not on the titles of the people advancing them. Reflecting afterward with her staff, Crockett said, "This was never about humiliating Professor Dershowitz. It was about making sure every voter's voice is protected, through rigorous constitutional interpretation and through lived reality. That's where justice actually begins." The Crockett-Dershowitz showdown endures as a landmark demonstration that confidence, preparation, and moral clarity can redefine who gets taken seriously in America's public square. A new voice had arrived, and it was here to stay. If you enjoyed this detailed breakdown of the Crockett-Dershowitz confrontation, please remember to like the video and subscribe to our channel. We cover the biggest political moments and analyze their lasting impact on America's changing landscape. Hit the bell so you never miss our latest takes on the rising voices shaping the future.